It's go time.
Calgary General Manager and Head Coach Dave Dickinson discusses the Vernon Adams Jr. trade.
No disrespect to anyone else that's been here, and I want to make that clear because I really believe it. Some of the issues we had certainly didn't involve with it around the quarterback room, but we feel we've got a winner and a guy we really wanted.
Welcome to Third Down Gamble with your hosts, Don Charbin and Heath Graham.
Welcome back, everyone. Boy, we've got a lot to go through. This has just been an unbelievable week in so many different ways. We've got quarterback signings, we've got trades, but first and foremost, let's get to one of the issues that maybe isn't getting enough press, and we'll put it to you right here. Winnipeg Blue Bombers seem to be a little bit hesitant right now signing their general manager and their head coach to contract extensions. It's normally a practice that after a successful season and you're coming to the expiration of your contract, that the president comes down to you and says, hey, let's talk about beyond this contract so that we can get you locked up because we're happy with what's going on. Not the first time this has happened, especially with Kyle Walters, but now is Wade Miller holding his cards back because he wants to see what happens in 2025.
It's a possibility, and you certainly would understand where Wade Miller is coming from. At the same time, I don't think there's a sense of urgency by anybody involved. Mike O'Shea seemed to be pretty dismissive when the question was asked whether he'd be looking to sign the extension right away or not. He's fine with the way things are. Kyle Walters, last time their contracts came up, there was talk of Kyle Walters no longer being the general manager of the Blue Bombers, and that was put to rest when he did eventually sign the extension. I guess you can look at it from the perspective of not achieving the ultimate goal over the last 3 seasons in losing Grey Cups. Did they fail to show their full potential? On the other side of the coin, you've got a team now that has won 4 straight regular season division titles, been to 5 straight Grey Cups, won 2 of them. That success is there. It's a matter of whether they want to stay with the status quo or look elsewhere. Something that we will discuss further is right now it's unlikely that they've got a returning offensive coordinator. That opens up some other questions with the team as well. But I'm not too worried at this point about what's happening with that Bomber staff.
Now, why would Wade Miller wait on this? Normally, in these types of situations, as I put in my little preamble, presidents, if they're satisfied with the work, typically try to get this done so it's not a distraction. So no one's being asked during the season, are you coming back next year? What's the status of your contract? We know it's expiring. What are you going to do? What are the negotiations at? All these types of questions that come up. And you can nip it in the bud and put it away. No, typically this is done almost immediately after Grey Cup so that you can put this to bed and move on with your operations. Wade Miller is a type of guy that seems to want to hold back on these things. It's not like he wants to make the big splash. He's not that type of person. But he does not like to get things done ahead of time. He wants to wait until he's good and ready and he's satisfied.
I think part of it is everybody taking a chance to stop and take a deep breath. They've been, as I said, very successful over the last several years, and with that is the added time of playoff games, of prepping for the Grey Cup, all of those types of things, and with the disappointment of losing this last one, maybe everybody just needs a little bit of time to cool off, think things over, and come back to it with a reinvigorated sense of energy.
What and how do you gain that reinvigorated sense of energy when you're looking at your status in Winnipeg? And most people think that O'Shea, it's a no-brainer. He'll be back. That's if he wants to be. For Kyle Walters, this is the second time in a row now that he's gone into the final year of his contract waiting for that discussion to happen. And regardless of if you've lost the Grey Cup and it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, you still have to get this done at some point if you want to retain him.
Yeah, and I think they're also looking right now at a couple of pieces further down the ladder that may be falling as well, and just getting a clearer picture of that. They've given permission for Buck Pierce to interview for a couple of vacant head coaching positions. They've allowed Richie Hall to interview for some upcoming defensive coordinator positions as well. And maybe it's an opportunity now to let that settle a little bit before they make decisions. You've also got Teddy Gavea and Danny McManus, potential targets for some general manager positions. If one of those isn't the successful candidate in Hamilton potentially, do you look at maybe bringing them into that general manager role in Winnipeg if you're not sold on Kyle Walters being the guy? So I think they're kind of waiting for some of those other pieces to the puzzle right now.
We've talked about it. You've brought it up. Let's go to it. There are two teams in the CFL right now that are looking for head coaches. First to the gate were the Edmonton Elks. When they made their changes with the new ownership, there was going to be something happening. Chris Morris became the new president. Ed Hervey is now the new general manager. They want to put a stamp on that football team, and they have, according to 3 Down Nation, about a short list of 6 people that they're going to be interviewing. First and foremost of those is the man that was just recently let go in British Columbia, and that's Rick Campbell. Now, he's got a long history through his dad in Edmonton, Hugh Campbell, who is pretty much beloved by that franchise and for what he did with that team while he was there. His son, Rick Campbell, was a guy that worked his way through the ranks with Edmonton, and he did get up to defensive coordinator before he finally got a head coaching job with the Ottawa Red Blacks. It wouldn't be unreasonable for him to return. Given what happened in BC, especially with the Rourke, Vernon Adams Jr. missteps that happened in September, do you think his stock has been tarnished a little bit? Or is this so important to Chris Morris and Ed Hervey to get the gang back that was there 20 years ago?
It certainly sounds like he's the front runner from what we're hearing in the rumor mill. Whether that comes to fruition or not remains to be seen. The main reason that he's considered the front runner is that connection with Ed Hervey, and I think that does pull a lot of weight. Obviously, general managers and presidents want to bring in people that they're familiar and comfortable with, so it really depends on what their comfort level is with Rick Campbell. Any of these head coaches or coaching candidates haven't forgotten how to coach. Sometimes your message just isn't getting delivered to that team anymore, and it's time to move on. And I believe Rick Campbell is a good coach. The 2024 season in BC was one to forget. There was a lot of missteps along the way, and things were poorly handled. A clean slate in Edmonton might be a better opportunity for him, and I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see him get that head coach position. But there's some other very, very worthwhile candidates to interview, and it's up to Chris Morris and Ed Hervey to do their diligence and make sure they are speaking to everybody and giving everybody a fair shake.
Rick Campbell, coaching career all time, he's about -10 on the win-loss column. He has brought Ottawa to a Grey Cup, and he did bring BC to 2 12-6 seasons to lose out to Winnipeg in the West Final both times. Sadly for him, with injured quarterbacks going into the football game each time. He is a good coach. There may be baggage, and that's all I'm suggesting. Mark Killam, who was let go by the Calgary Stampeders. There's a guy that could be in the offing for multiple jobs. But he's the type of guy, and he's a Canadian, he's from Lethbridge. He spent a lot of years with the Calgary Stampeders. Everyone thought he was going to be the heir apparent, but it didn't work out. Now Killam is in the running for Edmonton. He has not had a head coaching position before. This would be his first. A lot of times when you view special teams, you're looking at a guy that's dealt with everybody that's on the field.
This one is interesting to me with the amount of time he put in with the Calgary Stampeders to be cut loose this season. It would really be something if he's signed by their rivals, their provincial rivals up the highway, and he would come in with some fire and some revenge on his mind, and I would imagine it would make those Labor Day and return matchups even hotter than they normally are. He's a fiery personality as well, so he's kind of the antithesis of Rick Campbell in that personality point of view, and it really, that will factor into the direction that Edmonton wants to go. Which type of personality are they looking for? And as we go down the list of some of these candidates, there are certainly people that fall into both of those categories of the soft-spoken or the fiery coach, and it'll be really interesting to watch where Edmonton wants to go with this.
Well, you've got Jordan McSimic, another Alberta-raised coach who came from actually the burbs, if you want to call them that, in Edmonton and St. Albert. And he did spend some time with the Elks prior to going to BC to become their offensive coordinator. You've got Noel Thorpe, who also coached in Edmonton. He's now with the Montreal Alouettes. He's their defensive coordinator. He's raised his stock a lot with what he's been doing with that Alouettes defense this time around. And he could be in the running as well. You touched on it briefly, and let's get into it. We've got Buck Pierce, who has been the heir apparent coach for the last 2 go-rounds. He's the guy that everyone thought he's going to be in Saskatchewan. That didn't work out. Now there are 2 options here for him, Edmonton and BC. If he's got this opportunity availing him, he's got to make his move now, because I don't know how many more times you're going to get these opportunities.
Yeah, he, along with Mark Killam, I think are the 2 names that kept coming up repeatedly in these head coaching vacancies over the last couple of seasons. And I would imagine both Killam and Pierce are going to be candidates for both of these positions, as well as Jordan McSimic. I would give Buck Pierce the edge towards the BC job, just given that he does have a bit of a history with the BC Lions as well. What that would mean to Jordan McSimic is interesting as well, because Buck Pierce is an offensive coordinator, an offensive-minded coach. Is he going to want somebody like McSimic in that offensive coordinator role were he to become the successful head coach? What does that mean? The race is on right now, I think, as well, between the Lions and the Elks to make their decision, because there's going to be candidates that I think are going to get pretty serious consideration for both of these jobs. And,
of course, the incumbent, Jarius Jackson, is being considered as well, and you can't fault him for what happened with that team. He inherited a losing record with Chris Jones' departure. The team hadn't won. And at least he brought the team to some form of respectability by the end of the season. It wasn't where they wanted to be in the playoffs, but they had a big hole to climb out of. Does Jarius Jackson merit enough consideration, given that he was a part of what was there? Do you think he can get past that and prove to these guys that, hey, I'm still worth it?
I would hope so for his sake. I think what he did with the Elks this season after the Chris Jones firing was a very big step in the right direction. They didn't make a lot of splashes in player personnel after Chris Jones left. It was pretty much running with what they had. And to see him take that team that has struggled for the last several seasons and put up a winning record as the head coach speaks volumes to his ability. We'll see what happens again. It's now that you've changed that president, that general manager. Do they see a different direction for the team, or do they want to give the guy that's there a chance to prove his worth? And I would hope for his sake he gets this position, but as we've gone through this list, there is a handful of other candidates that are also worthy of the attention and of the opportunity to lead this team.
Go to British Columbia, and again, we're going to be repeating a lot of these names as the BC Lions look for a new head coach. And of course, they're looking for a new identity. This is part of what they want. Something had happened in the room that they didn't like, and they want a new vigor, as it were, to get out in front of the players. Where Campbell, in his time in BC, had a winning record, he could not get past that West Final, and I think they want now a coach that can get them into that Grey Cup game. And it was a huge disappointment that the Lions were out in the West semifinal this year. Buck Pierce, of course, Jordan McSimic, 1 and 2 in terms of candidates that are out there for that job. And McSimic, of course, is a bit of an incumbent, being their offensive coordinator.
He is, and Ryan Phillips, their defensive coordinator, is also in consideration. So you've got 2 internal candidates. And again, Buck Pierce, I would say, as far as the outsiders, would have the edge. Again, we're not in those rooms, so we're purely speculating based on history, on records as coordinators, parcel or connections with these teams, all that sort of thing as well. And again, Mark Killam comes up as a possibility. A couple other names on this list that are interesting. Mark Mueller, who joined the Saskatchewan Roughriders this past season as the offensive coordinator. That would be a very quick ascension for him up the ladder. He did come over to Saskatchewan with the hiring of Corey Mace as head coach. Interesting to see if he gets that head coach opportunity this quickly. Paul LaPolice and Kahari Jones are two former head coaches whose names have kind of popped up back into this as well. Kahari Jones, if everybody remembers, did start his CFL career as a quarterback with the British Columbia Lions, so there's a little bit of a connection perhaps there as well. And Mark Washington, who was fired earlier this season as the defensive coordinator with Hamilton, his name is being tossed about as well.
Ryan Phillips would be very interesting, given that he has a tremendous amount of tie to that football team, played his entire career there and has coached there. We'll have to see if there is a new head coach and Ryan Phillips isn't that person, what becomes of that? Does that necessarily bring about a change in his career path? Mark Mueller, it's the fact that the Lions asked for permission to talk to him. Now, if you're not familiar, he's the grandson of Ron Lancaster, who was a Hall of Fame quarterback with the Saskatchewan Roughriders and also took two different teams as a coach to the Grey Cup championship. He, as you say, hasn't had a lot of coaching experience in the Canadian Football League, especially at a high position, especially as OC, DC. This would be a quick rise, but he is 35, he's young, and just like the others, they're all in their 30s, especially the top candidates, and they're looking for these opportunities. And I think it's kind of a vigor thing. Again, I talk about this. Ed Hervey, if you listen to him and during his press conferences, he's talking about fire and getting energy in there. And I think that's why they want younger coaches. Corey Mace, for example, in Saskatchewan. Ryan Dinwiddie's still fairly young in Toronto. You want these people that can relate more with the players of today.
That's a good point as well. And I know I mentioned Paul LaPolice. This is coming from a 3 Down Nation article about the 8 candidates to be the BC Lions head coach. As much as Paul LaPolice is a great mind, he hasn't proven it in his opportunities to be head coach. He's one of those guys that maybe is more suited for a coordinator role. I love what he's doing on the broadcasts with TSN and on the panel as well. I think he brings a different perspective to that than former players do. And I see a lot of value there. But he has a 22-50 career record as a head coach, which outside of the 1 year he took Winnipeg to a Grey Cup, hasn't really been highly successful as a head coach.
Moving away from those two teams, and hopefully soon enough we'll have some answers as they go through their vetting process. The Ottawa Red Blacks have, again, tapped the Saskatchewan Roughriders to ask to talk to defensive backs coach Joshua Bell to become maybe their defensive coordinator. The other person, and you mentioned it already, Richie Hall from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Now, this is quite a if you want to look at generational, Richie Hall, 64 years old. Joshua Bell is still in his 30s. It's two different philosophies going head-to-head here, but Richie Hall has proven that he knows how to guide defenses to championship form.
He does, and I think if you're looking at somebody who will mesh well with Bob Dice, Richie Hall might be a great candidate in that situation. If you're looking for the young up-and-comer, Joshua Bell is a great choice as well. And there are so many coaching personnel changes in the mix here right now. It's, like I said, with Edmonton and BC, you want to get out in front of it. I think the team that hires and makes their decision the quickest is going to get that prime candidate. There's some other great names out there as well, but that's the key, is get in first and then let everything else fall behind you.
Bell, he led that defense. They had 24 interceptions last year, second only to Edmonton. And with Toronto, when he was defensive backs coach there, they led the league with 27 interceptions. So he can create a ball-hawking defense. For Richie Hall, you go back to 2021, 2022, when that defense was all everything, when teams couldn't score in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, like I said, like we discussed two really good candidates here, and I haven't heard any other names yet other than those two. And if it's narrowed down to that much of a short list, I would expect a decision on this pretty quickly.
The Argonauts are bringing in Brent Monson. And Brent Monson, of course, was the former defensive coordinator with the Calgary Stampeders. Now, Ryan Dinwiddie and Brent Monson had worked together in Calgary prior to the pandemic. Kevin Iben and William Fields. And I don't know what it means now for Fields and Iben. Are they still going to be in Toronto doing what they do in a different role, or is this a real seed change?
The comfort level between Ryan Dinwiddie and Corey Mace was very impressive, and with Mace having gone to Saskatchewan this past season, it left a little bit of a hole. Now, the people that filled in did a great job. I mean, we're talking about the Grey Cup championship team here right now, a team that their defense performed exceptionally well in that Grey Cup game. It does come down to that comfort level of Ryan Dinwiddie and Brent Monson having that past in Calgary as well. And Ryan Dinwiddie has solidified himself as a fantastic CFL coach in only 4 seasons as a head coach. You can't ask for the Grey Cup championship team to get much better, but if he sees a role to bring Brent Monson into that coaching staff as the defensive coordinator and he's going to jump on it, then it can only be better in the long run for the Argos.
Monson has earned his stripes. He has gone all the way from video controller for the Stampeders right through linebackers coach all the way up to defensive coordinator. And in his time there, especially early part of his career, that Stampeders defense was solid. They weren't spectacular, but he did produce some all-stars, and they did have some flashy people. The sad thing for the Stampeders was that those flashy people wound up playing for the Argonauts, the Alouettes, and the Rough Riders, because the Stampeders, for whatever reason, just didn't like to re-sign stalwart defensive players for a lot of years. The next man up philosophy maybe caught them, and that is something we'll get into later. Monson will be a good fit, and you mentioned, the relationship that Dinwiddie had, and maybe this is ultimately a trust issue, because he believes in Monson. Monson's a Southern Ontario kid. He's born in Hamilton. This is a homecoming for him in many senses, and it's a great opportunity for him to take over in a Grey Cup championship team that has a lot of people that are likely to be back to form a very, very strong defense. It's a great situation to really start again.
Brent Monson is another one of those names with the Calgary Stampeders that was there for so long. I believe between himself and Mark Killam, there is 35 years of coaching experience with the Stampeders. Another guy whose name kind of was floating around for several seasons as a next head coach potential. Now to see him possibly reunited with Ryan Dinwiddie in Toronto, I think it's a great opportunity for him.
General managers, we have, again, a situation where one team hires, another team has a vacancy as a result, and this involves the Edmonton Elks and the Hamilton Tiger Cats. The BC Lions brought up their general manager from in-house, so there was no vacuum created there. The Hamilton Tiger Cats are now looking to see who is going to become available and who do they want to take over that job. They've had some really successful people, obviously Hervey, Sean Burke, who's now with Ottawa. They want that type of person that can really assess talent and recruit. Winnipeg, again, is a great landing spot for anybody that's looking to hire, because how can you argue with what the Bombers have done for the last 10 years? Danny McManus spent time with the Hamilton Tiger Cats as a player and originally as a scout. Ted Gavea, what do you say about him? He's the Canadian talent guru.
He is, and those two have been working in tandem as the assistant general managers in Winnipeg for several seasons. What I'm curious to watch is whether or not Danny McManus wants to relocate and be back in Canada in this general manager role. He has a great connection with the Hamilton Tiger Cats, involved in their last Grey Cup win as a player. He is very well established in the southeastern United States. He does a lot of scouting and recruitment in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, that part of the U.S., and it's really up to him, I think, at this point as to whether or not he wants to move north of the border. Ted Gavea, as you mentioned, he has found Canadian talent very deep and very talented at many different positions, not just the traditional Canadian positions. He's really changed how CFL teams manage their rosters of Canadians. I think he's been ahead of the game, and other teams are now trying to play catch up in some of those roles. We've got, especially at running back and defensive secondary with the Bombers are now Canadian positions that you don't see a lot of. If he can bring some of that talent and that recruitment ability to the Hamilton Tiger Cats, that's a very big win for them.
For Danny McManus, if you have a chance, listen to the interview with Ryan McMaden that the BC Lions put out on YouTube, where he talks about what his role is going to be. And you're talking about Danny McManus spending more time in Canada and less time down in the southern states recruiting. The way McMaden was talking in BC, he was thinking that his job would change just marginally, where most of his efforts are still going to be recruiting all over this country and into the United States. He'd be on the road just like he was before, because he sees that as such a huge role as part of what he needs to do with the BC Lions. And I'm sure Danny Mac would be probably feeling the same thing. If I can have a base station somewhere in the States and I can still do what I do and then be up in Canada when I'm needed, he might see it that way as a win-win.
He could, and like I said, he's got some connections with Hamilton already, be it many years ago. He's been with the Winnipeg organization for 10 seasons now as well. That's a key point. And again, you talk about that familiarity we talked about with BC and Edmonton, some of those people that have the connections to those cities. He would be the front runner for the connection to Hamilton right now, but at the end of the day, I'm almost positive that at least one assistant GM will no longer be with the blue and gold next year.
And if you look at the BC Lions and maybe the Edmonton Elks and maybe the Hamilton Tiger Cats coming around and poaching, if you want to call it that, personnel from the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, the Blue Bombers themselves could look very different going into 2025, because you may not have your offensive coordinator, you may not have one of your assistant general managers, and who knows who else is going to be leaving that franchise. It's an opportunity-driven system. This is the CFL, the NFL. It doesn't matter which league. When opportunities avail, you've got to jump at them and take your chances, because that's the only way you're going to advance.
And with the number of free agents available every season in the CFL, a lot of times players move with coaches and coordinators that they're familiar with and comfortable with. So you're right, if Buck Pierce and one or both of these assistant general managers move on, there could be some players that tag along with them.
I'm Derek Taylor, the voice of the Bombers on 680 CJOB, and I listen to the Third Down Gamble podcast.
Well, we can't avoid it. Vernon Adams Jr. has been traded from the British Columbia Lions to the Calgary Stampeders. Now, Adams Jr. goes to Calgary with some picks. Going back the other way are some picks. And the Stampeders are thrilled that Vernon Adams Jr. is in the fold. We knew at the end of the season that they couldn't keep both Nathan Rourke and Vernon Adams Jr. And there was a strong indication that it was going to be Vernon Adams Jr. on the way out. It certainly played out that way very quickly, as once word got out, he was gone.
This is the least surprising result, and especially even with landing with the Calgary Stampeders, there's a lot of quarterbacks that are solidified in their starting roles right now, and not a lot of spots for VA to land if he was indeed going to be a starter. The Stampeders have signed PJ Walker to a contract for 2025 as well. This strongly indicates to me that Jake Mayer is out and will be looking to sign elsewhere as well. I'm not convinced that Vernon Adams is going to be able to turn the Stampeders around on his own. He'll have to get some more pieces around him, but they do have a dangerous and solid receiving core. So I would expect some offensive numbers to improve. It's a matter of where everything else falls with the Stamps.
The Stampeders needed to change what they were doing. After limping in at 6-12 last year, the Stampeders finally fell out of the playoff race this year. It's not something they're used to. Ever since John Hufnagel returned from the NFL, the Stampeders have been playoff bound almost incessantly. Dave Dickinson, in his press conference talking about the trade, mentioned a couple of things. Number one, that they're thrilled to have him and that they went hard after him. And they said that these discussions almost started in October, because not necessarily with the BC Lions, but in-house, because they knew that the Lions could not keep both quarterbacks. The Stampeders also, when they went to the negotiation table, were actually probably the strongest bidder. They came up with the biggest package. They felt comfortable in moving draft picks to get him because they are moving what-ifs. There were other suitors, but according to the BC Lions, they said that in terms of suitors, the Stampeders were the biggest. Others were kicking the tires, as it were, but weren't really coming up with anything that they could live with. They had hoped to move Vernon back to the east and maybe solve that equation right away. Don't have him in your division, but they knew soon enough that that wasn't going to happen.
Again, I think it comes down to what everybody is holding in their hand for quarterbacks right now. And unfortunately for the Lions, I don't think the trade value was there, given that so many teams are happy with what they've got. If we move east to west, and we'll get into this a little bit, Davis Alexander has signed a 3-year extension with the Montreal Alouettes. They do still have Cody Fajardo in the mix as well, who might be the odd man out. But Toronto is set with Chad Kelly. Ottawa seems to be happy with Drew Brown. Bo Levi Mitchell was an MOP candidate in Hamilton. Zach Collaros has 1 more year in Winnipeg. Trevor Harris has expressed interest in re-signing with the Saskatchewan Roughriders as well. And that really leaves you Calgary and possibly Edmonton. They've got McLeod Bethel-Thompson and Trey Ford to deal with as well. So as far as teams that were actively pursuing a new number 1 quarterback, Calgary was by far the front runner.
He did mention that the team has been terrible at keeping free agents, and that's one of the things that they're going to work hard on in the future. Because one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, look at all the players that won a Grey Cup with the Toronto Argonauts and how many of them, I believe it's 8 or 9, that were former Stampeders and quality players that were with the Stampeders. You can't let talent leave all the time. Sometimes you have to pay talent to keep it around.
And I know that the Lions were hoping to land a first-round draft pick in this exchange. As of right now, because the Edmonton Elks forfeited their first-round draft pick to sign a player, and because the BC Lions are potentially looking at losing a draft for salary cap reasons, this could essentially move that pick up into the 9th spot overall, which, even though it would technically be a second-round pick, is in that first round window.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny math when you think about it, and I don't know if trades necessarily are subject to the salary cap rules where you have to give up draft picks. My thinking is probably not, and this is one way to get around it, but right now what they do have is Calgary's 2nd pick in this year's draft in 2025, which is the 9th overall, because Edmonton, they forfeited their pick in the 2025 draft in the first round. If the BC Lions are concerned about not having draft picks, yes, they got a bunch coming in this trade. So if they took a chance, they spent the money, they went over the cap, they know they're going to take their hits, but this is the way to soften the blow? No problem with that. You can do that if teams are willing to go along with you.
It was very well done by the British Columbia Lions to get, I think, maximum value for what they could to trade for Vernon Adams Jr. Draft picks are important as well, as we talked about the Canadian talent, and this was a fantastic way for them to get back into the mix, having potentially sacrificed a couple of picks earlier on to try to get into that home Grey Cup.
We touched on it just ever so slightly, but let's get into this Montreal situation with Danny Machocha, who has now made his choice. We had thought going into this week that there's pressure on him to figure out which quarterback is going to be his starting quarterback. What is it going to be, Davis Alexander or Cody Fajardo? Now, how do you argue against Fajardo? He led him to a fantastic season this year. Granted, he missed a few games. Alexander came in and was undefeated. But then you look back to last year, of course, the 2023 season, and he led the Alouettes to a Grey Cup victory. How do you say no to that? But Davis Alexander gives you the prospect of a future. He's 26 years old. He's young. His future's ahead of him. And the Alouettes went big after him, signing him to what could amount to a $1.2 million contract over the next 3 seasons.
This indicates to me that Cody Fajardo is probably on his way out in Montreal. I don't feel that he would be comfortable in a backup role with the Alouettes at this point, although he has been quite happy in the city of Montreal and has spoken fondly about the Alouettes organization. I think this is a clear indication that the Owls want to get younger at that position. They're shaving 7 years off going with Davis Alexander over Cody Fajardo, and that's something that you can't overlook. It's a small sample size with Alexander, but he was very successful when he did take the field for the Alouettes, and they're investing a lot in hoping that that's not a flash in the pan and that he's the real deal.
Well, Alexander's been there a couple of seasons, so it's not like he's a new quantity coming into this situation. The first year of the contract, he's going to get $258,000 in hard money. He's going to get $120-some thousand in bonus money as well. That's going to have a maximum value of $336. The deal tops out at $406 in 2026 and $456 in 2027. That's starter money. That's not quite Bo, that's not quite Harris, but that's starter money in the Canadian Football League. Danny Maciocia was bullish on this. He said flat out, this is the future of our franchise. He is going to be the future quarterback for our needs. And if that's what he wants, Danny Maciocia now has made his choice. And for Cody Fajardo, you've got to think about your situation. If you like Montreal well enough and you can live with the situation, do you take that pay cut? Because he's going to have to take a shave over the $500,000 or more that he's making to make him a backup salary.
And he's due for some bonus money mid-January, so the decision will be made over the next month and a half. I recall a conversation we had a couple of seasons ago when the Winnipeg Blue Bombers made the decision to not re-sign Andrew Harris, and he moved on to the Toronto Argonauts. At that time, we talked about making the decision a year early as opposed to the year late, and that's a similar situation to what the Alouettes are looking at here. They don't want to lose what they have in Davis Alexander. And yes, Cody Fajardo won them the Grey Cup in 2023. He was one of the front runners for MOP before he got injured in 2024. But they have to look at it big picture. And if they're willing to put the money and investment into Davis Alexander, I don't think it means they can bring Cody Fajardo back. It's a tough decision, and it's not one I'm sure that they took lightly, but they need to look at the long-term success of this franchise. And if they're confident that it's Davis Alexander, which it appears they are, they've made the choice that fits them best.
But they have to do something with Cody Fajardo. You do not want to give that asset up for free. That bonus that's sitting there, that's to protect the player. People will say, well, if the team cuts him, that's the certainty value that bonus provides, so that the player has enough time to make his way onto another franchise. Now, Cody Fajardo has been around. He's started in Toronto, he went to BC, wound up in Saskatchewan, and then moved over to Montreal. So he's done the tour, as it were. Ironically, he seems to have chased Vernon Adams Jr. around the league in the last few go-arounds, where Adams Jr. was in Saskatchewan, then Cody came. Adams Jr. was in Montreal, then Cody came. Adams Jr. went to BC. Does he wind up back in BC? He and his agent do not want to take a pay cut and work with a backup salary. Then they're going to have to move him. And where do you move him? BC would not be a landing spot if he wants to make that same sort of money. But dare I say Saskatchewan? Or is Cody Fajardo in a really tough spot right now?
Yeah, I see Edmonton as a spot that's maybe chasing a starting quarterback. But again, they have a whole new regime in, and they're looking at what they have internal right now. Do they want to give up on somebody like Trey Ford or try to keep him in a backup role and bring somebody else in to start again? That's a tough situation to deal with there. And beyond that, you're right, Saskatchewan with a 39-year-old Trevor Harris, there might be some opportunity there, but with only 9 teams in the league, there's only 9 starting quarterback jobs out there. So sometimes there's some very talented players that can't quite find the opportunity that they're looking for.
Well, even Vernon Adams Jr. in this trade with the Stampeders, he is open to renegotiating his contract because he's making over $5.5 to appear in BC. He's going to have to make less than that, I think, especially if they want to consider PJ Walker. And of course, PJ Walker, who just got signed, now finds out from the head coach, who took the time to phone him and say, this has happened. PJ Walker's got to have his head spinning. Like, I just signed with you guys. Am I not the future? He's younger than Vernon. I mean, what are they going to do? And Dickinson keeps talking about the positive quarterback room. They need a positive room. They need a bunch of strong people. Cody Fajardo, I hope something gets worked out that satisfies him. He's paid his dues in so many ways, but Cody Fajardo is a good quarterback. He's maybe not seen as an elite quarterback, and then he does 2023, so who knows? It's so tough to tell with him.
There's only 2 years difference in age between PJ Walker and Vernon Adams Jr., so not a huge step, not as big of a gap as we're looking at with Montreal in their Alexander versus Fajardo math. So PJ Walker, it'll be interesting to see what he brings to the Calgary Stampeders. I know Dave Dickinson was high on bringing him in, and it's going to be very tough for him to unseat Vernon Adams as the number one quarterback. But if he can prove enough, it might be a good fit in the long run to have that opportunity to learn the Canadian game and get involved with a guy like Vernon Adams Jr. as your mentor.
Now, speaking of quarterbacks that took a shave, that was Bo Levi Mitchell last year, who went from 522 to 225.50 to come back and play for the Hamilton Tiger Cats at an incentive-laden contract where performance, touchdowns, all that sort of stuff added up to more money for him. He doesn't want to do that a second time. After being an MLB candidate, in my mind, should have been the MOP of the league last year. I think this was a mistake that they chose the way they did with Brady Oliveira. Not that Brady Oliveira didn't deserve it, but he should have won it the year before. And I don't like makeup calls. That's my problem with this. Bo lit the league up once he got settled in Hamilton. And I don't care about this crap about garbage time. The Tiger Cats were in most of the games that they were playing until the last minute, and Bo was one of the main reasons why.
The Tiger Cats looked at the 2024 season as a prove-it season for Bo Levi Mitchell because they also had Taylor Powell as an up-and-coming quarterback. This is another situation where there's going to be a very talented player on the outside looking in, because I don't think they can afford to pay Bo Levi Mitchell into that $400,000 or $500,000 range and keep Taylor Powell happy. Bo Levi Mitchell definitely deserves a bump in salary based on how he performed in 2024. And again, a guy that's probably got a couple of seasons left in him. This is going to be one of it, if not his last contract, certainly close to his last contract. So it's a chance for him to make some big money at the tail end of his career.
For Mitchell, goes to Hamilton with big money attached to his name. Things don't go well. Scott Milanovich comes in. There's some discourse between the two. He has that East semifinal where he only plays 6.5 minutes, isn't happy about how he was used. Bo is not one to hold back from his feelings. Yet he still wants to play in Hamilton. He just wants the terms of his contract to reflect more of what he did the previous year. And it's this constant pain of trying to figure out what a value of a player is, because you can only base it on what he did, not what he's going to do. Or can you, as with Davis Alexander?
I'm sure that the Tiger Cats haven't given up on Taylor Powell at this point either, so that has to be part of the conversation of what the future is like for the Hamilton Tiger Cats and whether they can keep Taylor Powell as part of it.
Let's go to Edmonton, and they've got Trey Ford in Edmonton, and one of the things that came up at the end of last year, of course, was his contract was up. He was going to be an FA. Well, Ed Hervey came out very quickly and said he's very motivated to have him on that roster. And what does that mean for McLeod Bethel Thompson? He's not in the conversation right now. Maybe coaching is where he's going to move next. I agree with Hervey. I think if you're going to make Trey Ford want to come back to Edmonton, you're going to have to get out in front of the narrative and speak to him and say, look, I want you to be the guy.
And this is something we talked about pretty much immediately after the Chris Jones firing and the Larry Thompson ownership bid and taking over of the franchise. Was this is their opportunity to make Trey Ford feel welcome and that they want him to be a part of the Edmonton Elks franchise for the foreseeable future and possibly the long term. the marketability of a Canadian starting quarterback in this league is huge. We've seen what's happened with the BC Lions and Nathan Rourke as well. There are certainly some wrinkles in Trey Ford's game, but what he has done is win games for the Edmonton Elks over the last couple of seasons when pretty much no other quarterback has managed to do it. I like what Ed Hervey is saying about giving him that chance to be the number one guy. That's huge, and I would imagine they'd be looking at probably a 2-year contract at this point, see what he can do and give him that opportunity to really take ownership of that role.
One of the things you're going to have to do, though, is pay him starting money. You cannot hold him back anymore. He's going to have to be paid, not necessarily what McLeod Bethel Thompson made, but somewhere in the 75 to 80th percentage of that, so that he's making, in no uncertain terms, over 3.5 and maybe close to 4.5 as the Edmonton quarterback. Make it clear that that's your role. Hervey sees him as dynamic. He sees him as electric. He sees a lot of things that Trey Ford can bring. And so many people point to that game against Winnipeg, and they say that he can't beat a team that has a great defense. Well, I kind of push back. He beat the Rough Riders and did it rather easily. And the Riders proved at the end of the season that that was a pretty strong defense. That game that they were in Edmonton against Winnipeg where he looked bad, it's haunted him. Davis Alexander, the greatest thing since sliced bread, if he's only got a sample size of 3. Why are you picking on Trey Ford for the same reason on a sample size of 1?
And if you're going to pick on a quarterback for not beating Winnipeg on a team that struggled to win games in general, then where's the outcry about Nathan Rourke not being able to beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers? He's had a much larger sample size and many more opportunities to beat Winnipeg. He's failed to do so. So I don't think you can take that as the knock on him. It's the question of the pocket passer capabilities versus the scrambling quarterback. And if you're okay with it, like I said, Trey Ford is exciting to watch. He makes things happen when he's on the field. He finds a way to win games. They may not be pretty. He might not be throwing for 350, 400 yards, Vernon Adams type gunslinging games, but he gets the job done. And this will be a big test for him and a big test for the new regime in Edmonton to see the direction that they go.
There's a quarterback in the Hall of Fame named Damon Allen who apparently couldn't be a pocket passer, and yet Trey Ford may not be a Damon Allen type. Trey Ford, I still believe, is dynamic, and he extends plays. And as a defense, you hate that, because now your cover of a receiver isn't 3 seconds, it's 4 seconds, it's 5 seconds. How do you keep up with a guy that you don't know where he's going and a quarterback that's pressuring you from the backside because he may run across the line of scrimmage and run for 15 or 20?
He does bring some wrinkles for sure, because he can throw the ball on the run. He can get out of the pocket and find the guy that's coming back to the ball. Or, like you said, he can tuck it and make positive yardage. And all he has to do is make 1 or 2 guys miss, and he can turn those scrambles into a 30, 40, or 50-yard run, and then he's thinking end zone.
Third Down Gamble uses the expert resources of the Canadian Football League and 3 Down Nation. For up-to-date, insightful statistics and analysis, please visit cfl.ca and 3downnation.com. The CFL on CBC theme music is used with written permission from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
Thank you for listening to our show. Third Down Gamble is hosted on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter, where our handle is @ThirdDownGamble. Join us again next time. The Third Down Gamble Podcast. Audio worth watching.